new chair for the Involvement Advisory Group, and I'm kind of really excited about today because it's about diverse communities, it's about ethnic minorities, health inequalities, and I think there's a lot of strong, in-depth experience I have in those areas. And also, I'm kind of looking forward to getting to know everybody today. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Hamid. Savi, over to you.
I'd like to add my thanks to everybody for being here today. The ARC South London, Applied Research Collaboration South London, is one of a number of research collaborations bringing together different organisations to undertake health and social care research. I think there are about 15 such ARCs across England, and each is slightly different. In our ARC and other ARCs and other organisations in recent years, much has been said about co-production as it affects health and social care research. And I think it offers maybe unique possibilities for health and social care researchers to work in true partnership with people from groups which are often underserved, which may be not properly listened to or involved in decisions around key issues. For instance, disabled people, Black, Asian and other minority ethnic groups, people on low incomes, LGBT+ people and others facing inequalities. Yet it's even more challenging to get this right than other forms of involvement, I'd say. The National Institute for Health Research, which is in some ways a parent body for a lot of organisations and plays a key role in encouraging and funding research in the UK, or in England, and working with other partners elsewhere in the UK, has described co-producing a research project as an approach in which researchers, practitioners and the public work together, sharing power and responsibility from the start to the end of the project, including the generation of knowledge. And in a recent policy press book, which is available free online, at some point I think we might add the link to the chat, COVID-19 and co-production in health and social care research, policy and practice. The editors discussed what co-production actually means. They wrote, "We did not want to exclude good practice by being too prescriptive in our definition, but central to our understanding of co-production in this book are processes through which inequalities in power are acknowledged and addressed to facilitate collaboration. And that includes in agenda setting, not just what happens further down the road in research." I was honoured to be invited to contribute to this, and I'm delighted that two of the editors, who also wrote chapters for this book, are with us this evening to get us started in thinking about co-production and some of the issues that this raises and what it means in practice, because a lot of people say it's a good idea, but how do we actually do it? Peter Beresford is co-chair of Shaping Our Lives, a user-led organisation working for inclusive involvement of disabled people and others from marginalised communities. He's a long-term user of mental health services, a service user researcher, who's a visiting professor in various places and has been involved with ARC East of England and has helped to create greater awareness of the vital importance of people who are being researched having a say in the research. Josephine Oclu is our very own equity, diversity and inclusion lead in ARC South London. She's also a senior researcher and Health Foundation Improvement Science Fellow at King's College London, and has long been a champion for harmed patients and their families. So we'll be able to get some of their insights. And I think at this point, I can hand over to Peter, unless there's anything else that Hamid or Zoe would like to add. Just apologies to anyone who's having difficulty with the sound. I think most of us are hearing fairly clearly. So if you're having a real struggle, you may want to try logging off and logging on again, or just rechecking the equipment to see you've got it up to the maximum volume.
Thank you very much, Savi. And Peter, delighted to have you here to talk to us.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Can people hear okay?
Yes. Yes.
Yep.
Great, thanks. I've got very little time, so I'm going to try and use it properly. Just want to start with going back to the description that Savi kindly gave for me. So I see myself as a user researcher, and I was on this body with a woman who I'd known previously as someone who was very powerful in a grant-giving organisation, but now we were sort of like on an equal level in this organisation as trustees. And one day she said to me, Peter, I know you're a service user, but I always think of you as a researcher. See, so as the saying goes, there's no answer to that. And I thought afterwards, when you work out what you should have said, you know, how do I subtract the service user bit? And, you know, how do I not be? I mean, but it was interesting. And she was actually, I think, a positive person who was trying to get to understand better, working in, I should say at the time, more participatory ways. The word co-production wasn't in the dictionary at that time, but that brings me on to the second thing I briefly wanted to touch on, which was I've tried to think back to prepare for today to things that have been good as well as things that have been bad in my experience. And I've been lucky to have a lot of experience. And it's really weird. I've been involved in heavily participatory initiatives which have been completely unparticipatory and very painful. I've also been involved in consultations which have turned out to be about transferring power. So you never know where you are. It's very confusing, I feel, because you don't know which ones are the most helpful ones to involve yourself in or to pick up on. But I wanted to give two examples of what I regard as co-production before we were using the word. The first, and I don't want this to sound inappropriate, but I was with colleagues from Shaping Our Lives. We were working with a big, important knowledge organisation with a woman in that organisation who, in my opinion, fulfilled the criteria of what it takes to be quite generally despised in our society. That's to say, she was a middle-aged woman. And I think that there's one category of people, apart from the others, that people rightly more often represent that's taken as having minimal value, and that is middle-aged women. But she had never been involved in participatory initiatives before. She absolutely sought to enable Shaping Our Lives and the things that we wanted to do to become things that were central in her organisation, which she supported and made real with an equalising of power. And we used to say about her, it's where I got the phrase from, some people get it and some people don't. And she was just one of those people who got it. I don't know what it was about her background of experience that meant that she was someone who was always working in a kind and subtle way to make it possible for the diversity of people involved in shaping our lives and our ideas to get real ground and strength through her organisation, to be published under their auspices, which gave us more authority, and to get financial backing. The second example I want to turn to is when I wasn't initially involved in this, but somebody who I did know a bit, who was a non-service user working at a middle level with a middle range charitable organisation for mental health service users, struggled to get money from government funding, which he got to carry out a user-led research project. And you could say, well, that's very inappropriate. What he did was he got money, well over £100,000, and he managed to find a way of having a complete free-for-all. So he then brought together a group of people that he had experience of working with, of knowing or working with in his organisation as survivors who were interested in doing different things, who were quite active. He approached me to be a survivor consultant, and then we met. And he basically, the menu he gave us was, I know none of you, except for me, have done kind of conventional research or research before. One person had worked in asking people their views, you know, for a commercial organization. But we've got this money and we can do what we want with it. And we've got some support from Peter, and we will work out together. You will work out together if that's okay. And if there are other people you want to suggest or you don't want to do it, fine. And it was interesting because most of us of the group wanted to do Project X, which came from their ideas. But there was one person who didn't really fancy that and thought that she might do another project. And what was interesting about what he said was, well, if that's all right with everybody else, why don't we do that? And you can do your own project. In the end, she decided not to do that because she wanted to work with the other people. But we carried out a project, which I thought was good quality research, where there was an investment of utter commitment to them, the service users, that I was there to help and to be someone that he knew would be able to deal with him, to be able to do what they wanted to do with it, using the principles of survivor-led research. And it was a lovely experience, and it was really positive for people. The only minor glitch was when one person totally inappropriately had their benefits stopped through an ignorant local benefits agency, and we had to struggle, and that person was without benefits for several weeks, although everything had been apparently sorted out properly. So those are two things, and those two things taught me something which I've not seen as unhelpful in real attempts, self-conscious attempts at this kind of co-production since. One is to be trustworthy, and two is to be committed, and three is to try and find out from us as survivors, if you're not a survivor, as much as possible about what's likely to be helpful, to listen. And that brings me on to the other thing which I think we were able to deal with in both those projects, which is that everyone's not up to speed to do these things. All of us may need one or other kind of support and help. And I understand the concept of empowerment as incredibly helpful here, both personal empowerment and, when we've worked on that together, empowerment to make broader change. And I think that critical to supporting people's empowerment is that they have support to work out what they want to do, to gain skills, to gain confidence and all those kinds of personal things, but also that they learn ways, gain practical access points within organizations that say they want to work with them. So I would really put an emphasis on access and support in the fullest sense of both. But I want to talk more specifically briefly about access in another way from work which Shaping Our Lives has done, because we always talk about inclusive involvement, and we're not just happy with the idea of involvement. It's already been suggested rightly that if we're talking about involvement, unless we want only a bit of the picture, the more accessed bit of the picture, then we need to make that possible. And very, very briefly, we carried out a big project, a research and action project with local service user organizations to find out who was getting left out. And it was shocking, really, and I still think it applies. We found 5 groups of people essentially being left out of participatory schemes, and that really works. When we think about co-production, we must make sure we seek to change that. One, obviously, people in relation to the protected characteristics, but 2, also people in relation to their housing situation, people who are homeless, people who didn't have proper housing, people who perhaps did not have the entitlements that go with being a citizen through not having citizenship status. 3, people who communicated differently. That might be in relation to an impairment or in relation to your ethnicity, in terms of communicating non-verbally, communicating using signing, for example, or English not being a language you had or not being your first language. The next one was where people would assume you were too disabled, too much of a survivor to be able to be involved without checking out whether you wanted to be involved and what would make it possible for you to be involved. And finally, where you were seen as being too well equipped to be involved and might then end up being a pain in the arse because you didn't agree with what they wanted you to do and would demand different sorts of things. And all those 5 seem to me to be really, really important. But at the top of everything, I think when we're talking about co-production, we're talking about making it possible for there to be an equality between traditional understandings of knowledge and the lived experience, or as someone in a meeting I've just been to talked about it, living experience as of equal and important value, inclusive living experience. And one of the things I think is very important when we're talking co-production is to try and encourage people who might be on the other side of the counter to stop thinking, if they've been encouraged to stop thinking of themselves narrowly as workers or professionals, but also to think of what they are as a person, their overall identity, and what that might mean in terms of the broader living experience that they can bring to the table. Not trying to talk for the lived experience of survivors or disabled people, but talking for their own and using it to offer the insights that you get, which ultimately I think are what's most important here from being a sentient human being. Thank you.
Fantastic, Peter. That was really thought-provoking, and I'm sure we'll come back to lots of conversations later in the breakout. So I'll hand over now to Josephine, I think, and then we'll take questions maybe at the end when we've heard from both of you, if that's okay.
So thanks very much for inviting me to speak. And it's really good to be in the room and just having a conversation with you. And I think that one of the things that is great for me here this evening is that I haven't just got a great long list of words on a slide. Because I've been to quite a few events on involvement and having greater involvement, and I've been involved with various things recently, writing about how to do it better. And it just kind of feels a little bit to me as if, and when I was thinking about what did I want to talk about, what did I want to say here this evening, there was a sense that I just kind of wanted to set aside some of the words and just try and throw out some random reflections, and they didn't have to be kind of neat and tidy and publishable. They just needed to kind of be a little bit real. So it feels to me as if, you know, this should be a time when things are messy, because things have been messy and awful and difficult for so many groups at this time. So it really feels like the right time maybe to pull apart a little bit of what we've been doing and maybe writing about, because it just feels to me as if maybe we just want to get beyond the words a little bit, and we really need to do things differently. And I have to confess to being impatient, because I feel that if we can't do things differently now, and sometimes I do feel that when I'm in the room, and people may even, you know, pick up on my impatience, but I feel as if when so many groups are suffering, because I feel that it is about suffering when health inequalities are so bad. And I think that when so many groups are suffering, and we can be in the room as quite a kind of elite, non-diverse group of people, then I feel that part of co-production should be to be challenging and to push the boundaries a little bit. And I think that if we were opening up and widening the conversation, and we really were letting a broader group of people into the room, then I think they would challenge us and expect us to go well beyond some of the things that we've been doing for a long time. So when I wanted to do my reflections, as I was asked to do, the motivations and the challenges, I wanted to do this as this, you know, I'm using this word insider outsider. So yes, I'm a researcher, and I was formerly a senior lecturer in social work. And I actually used to teach about service user involvement and felt very passionate about it. But I never thought in my wildest dreams that I would come to the table as a parent and a harmed patient who'd lost a child due to medical negligence, and would actually have my whole career destroyed as I scrambled and struggled to find out why my child had died in the circumstances that she did. And I found myself then reduced to someone who was seen as a problem, who was pathologized, who was that grieving parent that people were very uncomfortable with, the sort of face that people didn't want in the room. So I feel that if I'm going to start throwing out how we do things differently, I think that one of the things I want to talk about is stigma, and how in the involvement process, we can stigmatize groups, and we can stigmatize them and pathologize them in such a way that whether we do it consciously or unconsciously, we are deciding that those are the people who are not the right people to be involved and the right people to be in the room. And for the last 10 or 15 years or more, since I found myself as a harmed patient, I have felt like I've had this stigma, because people feel uncomfortable when you've been harmed, because it's a poor experience rather than a good experience. And people often want you to come around the table with a good experience. But what happens if you've come from groups who either because of poverty, you know, a social class, or, you know, you come from groups where you faced inequalities, you may have had a lot of harm and poor experiences, and you want to talk about them. Because in talking about them, that's the reason that you've chosen to get involved, so you can make a difference. And so you've got to talk about those different experiences, and that may not fit into the types of involvement that we have been trying to create. So I feel that, you know, the challenges around co-production is that we've been building a top-down model. And I feel that that to some extent, the danger has also been, as professionals, that we may even have co-opted what people on the ground who have had poor experiences of services have created. They created a social movement, different groups, demanding that we do things differently, and we listen to them so that they don't get harmed again and have poor experiences. And then we create structures and ways of involving that only handpicks a few people that are deemed, you know, their faces are deemed to fit in the room. So there's the challenge. So there's some of the challenges to me, that we've simply got to broaden out the conversation, and we've got to be open to challenge. And I think that one of the biggest issues for me in moving forward with co-production is we can't do it unless we create the structures to support that process. So it isn't enough to just do it as an individual thing. If the structures are not there to support different groups, to support them and to enable them and empower them to be involved, and if we don't have, if we don't look at our structures and say, what are the structures that are further perpetuating exclusion, and which are not perpetuating a more inclusive environment. So the starting point for me in terms of some of the things that we want to do at this time, that which are urgent, are that we need to make equality, equity, diversity, inclusion the centerpiece for involvement. It's a shame that we've got to say that, because we haven't been doing that. And it's only with the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter and the inequalities that we are able to, equality, diversity and inclusion is allowed to speak its name, with all the pain that goes with it as well. So I think that we absolutely, in every shape or form, need to embrace that. And our starting point has to be, who's in the room, who's outside the room, who should be in the room, what does diversity look like, who are the diverse groups that we're talking about, and then to start thinking about how we can bring those groups in so we can change the conversation. Because I think the starting point is to change the conversation, to recognize that those who are in the room are probably not representative enough, and therefore they won't have the knowledge and the skills. And for us to say or to think that we do have that knowledge and the skills, and not least because we may have a couple of degrees and stuff like that, is not good enough. Actually, to make a difference, we do need the lived experience, we do need the experiential knowledge, and we've got to value the people who've had that real world experience, and we need to find a way to bring them into the room. So just a couple more points building on that. So we've got to do that work around having a broader, more challenging conversation. So we can't be scared about those challenging conversations. And it's not enough for me to read you out the definitions that say, oh, co-production is about, you know, more equitable ways, inclusive participation in collaborative partnerships, and so on and so forth. That's not enough. We have to think about inequalities of power, and we have to think about what that actually means in practice, who has that power and who doesn't. So some of the work that we've been doing as a starting point earlier on with the EDI agenda is to look at our decision-making structures, you know, and to look at where the power lies in those structures and who is involved with those structures. And we did start with an equality monitoring exercise. And I do think that whilst there are challenges with developing that, I think that we need to do it, because I think that if we don't know, you know, you know, who's in the room, and we don't know about that diversity, then we're not going to have the sense of who's already there and who isn't. And I'd also maybe lastly just like to say that if we're going to have those more challenging conversations, we need to have a broader community approach. And, you know, it pains me to think of all of those community groups out there with the knowledge who can help to co-produce with us to make it, you know, to make our research more inclusive, who we haven't found a way to work with. So a real priority for me is that early on in our research, we've got to have some really good community engagement strategies. We've got to look at building back trust with those groups, and we've got to look at sharing some of the power and the resources. So we can't just say, oh, people are not getting involved, or we can't find them, and so on and so forth. We need to use some of the funds to work with the groups, those community groups who have all of their own challenges of capacity and lack of funding. And we got to, and so sharing power also means sharing some of the funds, so that those groups can be properly involved in partnerships, and help to develop that co-produced approach. So I think that just to summarize, developing structures to support co-production, we've got to work out what those structures are, you know, looking at some of those, the decision making within our research. I would say don't adopt a deficit approach and decide that, you know, all of the changes have got to happen with the groups that we're working with. Let's kind of do that in training and induction with people who hold power, so that they think about equality and diversity in an empowering way, shifting the conversations, developing more community engagement strategies, and doing things differently. So maybe using peer research models to work more with co-production. Thank you. Sorry if that was a ramble, but that's some of my reflective thoughts. Thank you.
Fantastic, Josephine. And Peter, really thought-provoking. I think we've got a few minutes now for some observations and some questions from you. I just wanted to start by kind of picking up some of the things that you have both said. So I was thinking about the assumptions we make and the fact that we have an involvement strategy, and Peter's comment that actually we need to be really explicit. It is an inclusive involvement strategy, and it's not enough to assume that it is. We need to state that it is. But also, as Josephine says, we need to go beyond those words. So we need to see who's in the room and think about the 5 groups that Peter highlighted as being unrepresented. And I think Josephine spoke very passionately about the 5th group being too well equipped and therefore too challenging for some people to really want to invite in. And I also wanted to reflect on Peter's comment about everybody has some personal experience to bring. And I think although that is very different, that's about being human and therefore being vulnerable. And if you do that, then you are necessarily sharing a bit of that power by not being them and us, by saying actually everybody's got vulnerability and therefore let's look differently at power. And I take Josephine's point about actually what structures do we need to put in place. We can't assume that inclusivity just happens because we think it's important. We have to really work at it and we have to think about who we need to involve and how we actually reach out to people and develop that honesty and relationship that people believe that we will listen and be very different in our kind of relationships and interactions. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of time to think about your questions. So if people can bear with me and try and raise hands or shout out. Aha, I see Sarah.
Yes,
nice to see you, Sarah.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about my experience, which is over 4 years when I first came up with the idea for a study exploring how discharge planning might be improved and understanding what it takes to improve discharge planning. So I had an idea, but getting the idea to fruition and getting the funding has been a difficult journey. And there are lots of barriers in the way, not least by the NIHR. And I think there are barriers for many people. It was difficult for me, but I could afford to do it for 4 years, to work, put a huge amount of time into this. But you're immediately excluding all the people who couldn't do that, who couldn't drive their car to a meeting, who couldn't, so that anybody, I'm not academic, but anybody who comes up with a good idea for research, there should be some way of enabling them to take that idea forward and connect them into the right, with researchers and so forth. That's one thing. And I've actually challenged the NIHR because although it was my idea and I'm the lay co-lead, all the communication goes to my academic co-lead, not to me. I'm excluded in all the outcome letters, everything. So in terms of, and also on the application form, co-lead is right up at the top as being my professional colleague, and I'm down with the co-applicants. In terms of the messaging that the NIHR are giving me, they are not talking they may talk the talk about what co-production entails, but actually when I've tried to have a conversation with it, they've not followed up with me when I've tried to explore that issue of really working with people in a co-produced, 2 co-leads, one's got their experience, is clearly not as valuable as the professional co-lead. So I think that's something, but the thing about no funding up front, that's a really, the structure there excludes people from the start. I think that's really important because you've got to put the systems you've got to really make things easier for people to have an idea and start developing a proposal. So I think, that excludes masses of people, lay people, because you don't have to be an academic to get there, and I can prove that. So that's all I really wanted to say. It's just about, that sort of stigma. Again, one of the reviewers sort of commented on the fact that it was a very heavy commitment, that someone sort of implying that someone with lived experience isn't quite up to the job, so it's been a really hard struggle.
Thank you, Sarah.
I'll stop now.
And I know from our conversations that even when people seem to agree about co-lead, it takes a lot of pushing to get it actually agreed. I don't know if Josephine or Peter want to make any comments about what Sarah's just said.
I mean, I don't disagree. I think they're great comments, and I actually don't want to be the expert, if you see what I mean. I'm happy to just hear comments. You know, I'd like to hear a few more comments. Really, you don't have to ask us questions. I don't feel I need to be the expert. I think this is a conversation. I'm so happy to be having, you know, this is kind of great in a sense that there's a lot of us and we're having a conversation, and thank you for showing up so that we can do that.
I can't see any hands. Does anyone want to just shout out or raise a hand if they want to contribute?
There's Vita with a hand up.
Aha, I'm sorry, I can't see everybody. Vita, hello.
Hi, I'm Vita, and I'm on the public research panel, and I'm also involved in maternity and maternal mental health team for the ARC. I have to say I was very moved by what everyone has said so far, Peter and Josephine and Sarah as well. I just wanted to say a couple of things. One, going back to what Sarah just mentioned, is that it's very hard to go past the financial aspect. And so it is really important always to not shy away from it, and to always consider it when doing anything. So is it going to be possible financially to be involved and engaged for everybody? And how is this going to be possible? And we talk about this a lot. So for example, in research, we always go back to the fact that there has to be a budgeting straight at the start for the people who are going to be involved, that are not researchers, that are not salaried, that are not part of the initial research, so the service users, for example. But then another thing that I wanted to say is that going back to the point that Josephine made about always challenging and always challenging ourselves, challenging our structures, breaking them down in order to bring in new voices. And these are always the voices that don't get heard. We often talk about groups. There are groups of people who are constantly undermined, and people who are constantly harmed, and people who have worse outcomes. But I think it's also important to consider that sometimes individuals fall through the definition of group. And very recently, I had a meeting with Rachel, who's here, and Mary, and Zainab. I think Zainab is not on this call. And we talked about, we told our stories to each other, and you know, we could belong, each of us could belong to a group, but when talking more in depth, we realized that perhaps we were not in the groups that we considered ourselves to be in, or that we considered the other to be in. And so I think it's important to always challenge where we're putting ourselves and where we're putting others as a, you know, as a group. Thank you.
Thank you, Vita. Nanette, you've got your hand up.
Can you hear me? I mean, I don't know if it's the right moment to mention it, but we speak a lot, and lots of groups belong. We have to include minorities. We have to patient of all color, make sure it's equal. I think my main concern more and more is for people who are not computer literate, may not have one, older people, I'm not speaking people with disability or learning disability, and that's being the biggest challenge in the future. How can we include and making people who are not computer literate equal to everybody else? I think that's far more important to keep on speaking about including minorities and people who weren't born here and people who don't speak the language or are not white and British, whatever. Actually, I'm not British either. But I think that's really a challenge, and people will fall between the chairs because they don't know where to turn. Buying a computer is not for everybody such a problem. But looking after the computer, getting help, going on Zoom, and then the screen go blank, or they can't hear the voice, or they can't get in, that's a challenge, and which intimidates a lot of people. I don't know what your thoughts about it, but we have in the future now research and everything, make sure people who would like to be involved will get help. Yes, HUK gives free classes and free also free computers, but we have to make sure everybody is included and doesn't feel left out because they haven't got, the right technology at home and they're scared of it, and they will miss out. Sorry, that's my grumble of the day.
Fantastic, really important point. And actually, I think we've got one of the breakout groups that you can join where we're going to talk exactly about that. Smarajit Roy, I think your hand up.
Okay, thank you very much. I would obviously, like to thank Josephine for her usual excellent deliberation. We learn every day something new, and that was excellent again. But today I would like to ask Peter. He mentioned very important thing, and he said that you sometimes get people who are too much disabled, and also there are some people who are too well informed. And I find that is very, very true, because I've been sitting in the Community Support Network board for the last 10 years, and every meeting and everywhere I find that people who are too much disabled, their voice are not listened. We haven't got patience to listen to them in meetings or presentation. When you go there, they struggle to make their point of view, so that they can get some support, mental support. They need more mental support than financial support. Actually, a lot of people are very, very vulnerable. So they want to be comforted, but they're not given chance at all, and that's why the other group, the too well-informed group, they have their own agenda, and they try to bring new things to suit themselves, to add some new research and things like that, and they force their way in to their own agenda. And I myself have been struggling, like others. I have got my pet project, which we used to run for a long time for mental health people. We used to run drop-in center at 336 Bristol Road. And drop-in center was very, very useful, because people there are certain times when they can come without any appointment. They can have tea, coffee, and they can play, chess, board, and everything. They enjoy, and they forget that they have got some, some difficulties with health issues and things like that. But as I said, I'm on the board of Community Support Network, and we got sufficient funding. We got 6 full-time staff. We got about 400,000 budget every year from NHS. But because they are what we call is restricted, and unrestricted. Before we used to get unrestricted fund, but restricted fund we can't use at all. Even if we got spare money, we can't use for unrestricted fund. So these are the things, and these are the things we find it. I myself find it very difficult to have a pet project which will benefit local people. If you got an open house, people can come and join without any membership or without any identity or without belonging to any organization. They can just drop in and they can learn from each other. At one time we used to take people to swimming actually, on Friday, they used to go to swimming to Biston. We used to pay for them. Now we can't pay, although we got money, we can't pay. So these are the real problems that we should address through co-production or whatever it is. But I would like somebody to help or give some guidance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we might have time just for one more comment, or if anybody else wants to contribute.
I thought there was a really good comment in the chat, Zoe, about payments and what it's like if you're not working, and then you do work and then you have to wait ages for your payments, and that's definitely an issue, and that's kind of the perfect example of structures needing to change the structures. Because I've been working with peer researchers, and when they've done their interviews, they want to get paid, and then it's so embarrassing when you sort of have to say, oh well, it's got to go through these processes within the university, and you may not get it for several weeks, and they don't necessarily understand why they have to wait for so long. So I think there's something to be, and that's something about structures, isn't it? What concrete things can we do with our structures, and particularly, like the person said, imagine what it's like if you're not working.
Absolutely right, Josephine, and there's no reason why budgets shouldn't be delegated. We're not talking about large sums of money, are we? It's it's basic decency to people who are providing their time. We've heard quite a lot of challenges and issues. It's been a really, really thought-provoking conversation. I think it's now time for us to go into breakout groups, which